Now I am Gresham Zadam, and welcome back to Gresham Reads The Color Out of Space. This will be part 2 of the story, and judging by how many pages, there might be a part 3, but I am not sure just yet. We will have to wait and see, I suppose. Now, I'm finding this interesting because an unusual meteorite of an unknown composition falls from the sky and poisons, perhaps, or perhaps alters the land around it, causing plants to grow as they should not. It is interesting, to say the least. But enough speculation. Allow us to begin. The trees budded prematurely around Nahum's, and at night they swayed ominously in the wind. Nahum's second son, Thaddeus, a lad of 15, swore that they swayed also when there was no wind. But even the gossips would not credit this. Certainly, however, restlessness was in the air. The entire Gardner family developed the habit of stealthily listening, though not for any sound which they could consciously name. The listening was indeed rather a product of moments when consciousness seemed half to slip away. Unfortunately, such moments increased week by week, till it became common speech that something was wrong with all Nahum's folks. When the early saxifrage came out, it had another strange color, not quite like that of the skunk cabbage, but plainly related and equally unknown to anyone who saw it. Nahum took some blossoms to Arkham and showed them to the editor of the Gazette. But that dignitary did no more than write a humorous article about them, in which the dark fears of rustics were held up to polite ridicule. It was a mistake of Nahum's to tell a stolid city man about the way the great overgrown mourning cloak butterflies behaved in connection with the saxifrages. April brought a kind of madness to the country folk, and began that disuse of the road past Nahum's, which led to its ultimate abandonment. It was the vegetation. All the orchid trees blossomed forth in strange colors, and through the stony soil of the yard, in adjacent pasturage, there sprang up a bizarre growth, which only a botanist could connect with the proper flora of the region. No sane, wholesome colors were anywhere to be seen except in the green grass and leafage. But everywhere those hectic and prismatic variants of some diseased underlying primary tone, without a place among the known tints of earth. The Dutchman's breeches became a thing of sinister menace, and the bloodroots grew insolent in their chromatic perversion. Amy and the gardeners thought most of the colors had a sort of haunting familiarity, and decided that they reminded one of the brittle globule in the meteor. Nahum plowed and sowed the 10-acre pasture and upland lot, but did nothing with the land around the house. He knew it would be of no use, and hoped that the summer's strange growths would draw all the poison from the soil. He was prepared for almost anything now. Forgive me, dropped something. And had grown used to the sense of something near him, waiting to be heard. The shining of his house by the neighbors told on him, of course, but it told on his wife more. The boys were better off being at school each day, but they could not help being frightened by the gossip. Thaddeus, an especially sensitive youth, suffered the most. In May, the insects came, and Nahum's place became a nightmare of buzzing and crawling. Most of the creatures seemed not quite usual in their aspects and motions, and their nocturnal habits contradicted all former experience. The gardeners took to watching at night, watching in all directions at random for something. They could not tell what. It was then that they all owned that Thaddeus had been right about the trees. Mrs. Gardner was next to see it from the window as she watched the swollen boughs of the maple against the moonlit sky. The boughs surely moved, and there was no wind. It must be the sap. Strangeness had come into everything growing now, yet it was none of Nahum's family at all who made the next discovery. Familiarity had dulled them, and what they could not see was glimpsed by a timid windmill salesman from Bolton, who drove by one night in ignorance of the country legends. What he told in Arkham was given a short paragraph in the Gazette, and it was there that all farmers, Nahum included, saw it first. The night had been dark and the buggy lamps faint, but around a farm in the valley, which everyone knew from the account must be Nahum's in the darkness, had been less thick. A dim, though distinct luminosity seemed to inhere in all the vegetation, grass, leaves, and blossoms alike. While at one moment a detached piece of the phosphorescence appeared to stir furtively in the yard near the barn. The grass had so far seemed untouched, and the cows were freely pasteurized in the lot near the house. But towards the end of May, the milk began to bad. Then Nahum had the cows driven to the uplands, after which the apparent trouble had ceased. Not long after this, the change in grass and leaves had become apparent to the eye. All the verdure was going gray, and was developing a highly singular quality of brittleness. Amy was now the only person who ever visited the place. My mistake. And his visits were becoming fewer and fewer. When the school closed, the gardeners were virtually cut off from the world, and sometimes let Ami do their errands in town. They were failing curiously, both physically and mentally, and no one was surprised when the news of Mrs. Gardner's madness stole around. It happened in June, about the anniversary of the meteor's fall, and the poor woman screamed about things in the air which she could not describe. In her ravings there was not a single specific noun, but only verbs and pronouns. Things moved and changed and fluttered, and ears tingled to impulses which were not wholly sounds. Something was taken away. She was being drained of something. Something was fastening itself on her that ought not to be. Someone must make it keep off. Nothing was ever still in the night. The walls and windows shifted. Nahum did not send her to the country asylum, but let her wander about the house as long as she was harmless to herself and others. Even when her expression changed, he did nothing. But when the boys grew afraid of her, and Thaddeus nearly fainted at the way she made faces at him, he decided to keep her locked in the attic. By July, she had ceased to speak and crawled on all fours. And before that month was over, Nahum had got the mad notion that she was slightly luminous in the dark, as you now clearly saw was the case with the nearby vegetation. It was a little before this that the horses had stampeded. Something had aroused them in the night, and their neighing and kicking in their stalls had been terrible. There seemed virtually nothing to do to calm them, and when Nahum opened the stable door, they all bolted out like frightened woodland deer. It took a week to track all four, and when found they seemed to be quite useless and unmanageable. Something had snapped in their brains, and each one had to be shot for its own good. Nahum borrowed a horse from Ami for his haying, but found it would not approach the barn. It shied, balked, and whinnied, and in the end he could do nothing but drive it to the yard while the men used their own strength to get the heavy wagon near enough the hayloft for convenient pitching. And all the while the vegetation was turning gray and brittle. Even the flowers, whose hues had been so strange, were graying now, and the fruit was coming out gray and dwarfed and tasteless. The asters and goldenrod bloomed gray and distorted, and the roses and zinnias and hollyhocks in the front yard were such blasphemous-looking things that Nahum's oldest boy, Zenas, had cut them down. The strange puffed insects died about that time. Even the bees that had left their hives and taken to the woods. By September, all the vegetation was fast crumbling to a grayish powder, and Nahum feared that the trees would die before the poison was out of the soil. His wife now had spells of terrific screaming, and he and the boys were in constant state of nervous tension. They shunned people now, and when school opened, the boys did not go. But it was Ami, on one of his rare visits, who first realized that the well water was no longer good. It had an evil taste that was not exactly fetid, nor exactly salty. and Ami advised his friend to dig another well on higher ground to use till the soil was good again. Nahum, however, ignored the warning, for he had by that time become callous to the strange and unpleasant things. He and the boys continued to use the tainted supply, drinking it as listlessly and mechanically as they ate their meager and ill-cooked meals, and did their thankless and monotonous chores through the aimless days. There was something of stolid resignation about them all, as they walked half in another world between lines of nameless guards to a certain and familiar doom. Thaddeus went mad in September after a visit to the well. He had gone with a pail and had come back empty-handed, shrieking and waving his arms, and sometimes lapsing into an inane titter or whisper about the moving colors down there. 2-in-1 family was pretty bad, but Nahum was brave about it. He let the boy run about for a week before he began stumbling and hurting himself. And then he shut him in an attic room across the hall from his mother's. The way they screamed at each other from behind their locked doors was terrible, especially to little Merwin, who fancied they talked in some terrible language that was not of earth. Merwin was getting frightfully imaginative, and his restlessness was worse after the shutting away of the brother who had been his greatest playmate. Almost at the same time, the mortality among the livestock commenced. Poultry turned grayish and died very quickly, their meat being found dry and noisome upon cutting. Hogs grew inordinately fat, then suddenly began to undergo loathsome changes which no one could explain. Their meat was, of course, useless, and Nahum was at his wit's end. No rural veterinary would approach his place, and a city veterinary from Arkham was openly baffled. The swine began growing gray and brittle and falling to pieces before they died. Their eyes and muzzles developed singular alterations. It was very inexplicable, for they had never been fed from the tainted vegetation. Then something struck the cows. Certain areas, or sometimes the whole body, would be uncannily shriveled or compressed, and atrocious collapses or disintegrations were common. In the last stages, and death was always the result, there would be graying and turning brittle, like that which beset the hogs. There could be no question of poison, for all the cases occurred in a locked and undisturbed barn. No bites of prowling things could have brought the virus. For what live beast of earth can pass through solid obstacles? It must be only natural disease. Yet what disease could wreak such results beyond any mind's guessing? When the harvest came, there was not an animal surviving on the place, for the stock and poultry were dead, and the dogs had run away. These dogs, 3 in number, had all vanished one night, and were never heard of again. The 5 cats had left some time before, but their going was scarcely noticed, since there now seemed to be no mice, and only Miss Gardner had made pets of the graceful felines. On the 19th of October, Nahum had staggered into Ami's house with hideous news. The death had come to poor Thaddeus in his attic room, and it had come in a way which could not be told. Nahum had dug a grave in the railed family plot beyond the farm, and had put therein what he found. There could have been nothing from outside, for the small barred window and locked door were intact. But it was much as it had been in the barn. Ami and his wife consoled the stricken man as best they could, but shuddered as they did so. Stark terror seemed to cling around the gardeners, and all they touched, and the very presence of one in the house was a breath from regions unnamed and unnamable. Ami accompanied Nahum home with the greatest reluctance, and did what he might to calm the hysterical sobbing of little Merwin. Zenas needed no calming. He had come of late to do nothing but stare into space and obey what his father told him. And Ami thought that his fate was very merciful. Now and then Merwin's screams were answered faintly from the attic, and in response to an inquiring look, Nahum said that his wife was getting very feeble. When night approached, Ami managed to get away, for not even friendship could make him stay in that spot when the faint glow of the vegetation began, and the trees may or may not have swayed without wind. It was really lucky for Ami that he was not more imaginative. Even as things were, his mind was bent ever so slightly, but he had been able to connect and reflect upon all the portents around him. He must have inevitably turned a total maniac. In the twilight, he hastened home, the screams of the mad woman and the nervous child ringing horribly in his ears. 3 days later, Nahum lurched into Ami's kitchen in the early morning, and in the absence of his host stammered out a desperate tale once more, while Mrs. Pierce listened in on a clutching fright. It was little Merwin this time. He was gone. He had gone out late at night with a lantern and pail for water, and had never come back. He'd been going to pieces for days, and hardly knew what he was about, screamed at everything. There had been a frantic shriek from the yard then, but before the father could get to the door, the boy was gone. There was no glow from the lantern he had taken, and of the child himself no trace. At the time, Nahum thought the lantern and pail were gone too, but when dawn came and the man plodded back from his all-night search of the fields and woods, he had found some very curious things near the well. There was a crushed and apparently somewhat melted mass of iron, which had certainly been the lantern, while a bent pail and twisted iron hoops beside it, both half fused, seemed to hint at the remnants of the pail. That was all. Nahum was past imagining. Mrs. Pierce was blank, and Ami, when he reached home and heard the tale, could give no guess. Merwin was gone, and there would be no use in telling the people around, who shunned all gardeners now. No use either in telling the city, people at Arkham who laughed at everything. Thad was gone, and now Merwin was gone. Something was creeping, and waiting to be seen and felt and heard. Nahum would go soon, and he wanted Ami to look after his wife and Zenis if they survived him. It must all be a judgment of some sort, though he could not fancy what for, since he had always walked uprightly in the Lord's ways so far as he knew. For over 2 weeks, Ami saw nothing of Nahum, and then worried about what might have happened. He overcame his fears and paid the gardener place a visit. There was no smoke from the great chimney, and for a moment the visitor was apprehensive of the worst. The aspect of the whole farm was shocking. Grayish withered grass and leaves on the ground, vines falling in brittle wreckage from archaic walls and gables, and great bare trees clawing up to the gray November sky, with a studied malevolence which Ami could not but feel had come from some subtle change in the tilt of the branches. But Nahum was alive after all. He was weak and lying on the couch in the low-ceiled kitchen, but perfectly conscious and able to give simple orders to Zenis. The room was deadly cold, and Ami visibly shivered. The host shouted huskily to Zenis for more wood. Wood indeed was sorely needed, since the cavernous fireplace was unlit and empty, with a cloud of soot blowing about in the chill wind that came down the chimney. Presently, Nahum asked him if the extra wood had made him any more comfortable, and then Ami saw what had happened. The stoutest cord had broken at last, and the hapless farmer's mind was proof against more sorrow. Questioning tactfully, Ami could get no clear data at all about the missing Zenis. In the well, he lives in the well, was all that the clouded father would say. Then there was a flash across the visitor's mind, a sudden thought of the mad wife, and he changed his line of inquiry. "Nabby? Why, here she is," was the surprised response of poor Nahum, and Ami soon saw what he must search for himself. Leaving the harmless babbler on the couch, he took the keys from their nail beside the door, and climbed the creaking stairs to the attic. It was very close and noisome up there, and no sound could be heard from any direction. Of the 4 doors in sight, only one was locked. And on this he tried various keys on the ring he had taken. The 3rd key proved the right one, and after some fumbling, Ami threw open the low white door. It was quite dark inside, for the window was small and half obscured by the crude wooden bars, and Ami could see nothing at all on the wide planked floor. The stench was beyond enduring, and before proceeding further, he had to retreat to another room and return with his lungs filled with breathable air. When he did enter, he saw something dark in the corner, and upon seeing it more clearly, he screamed outright. While he screamed, he thought a momentary cloud eclipsed the window, and a second later he felt himself brushed as if by some hateful current of vapor. Strange colors danced before his eyes, and had not a present horror numbed him, you would have thought of the globule in the meteor that the geologist's hammer had shattered, and of the morbid vegetation that had sprouted in the spring. As it was, he thought only of the blasphemous monstrosity which confronted him, and which all too clearly had shared the nameless fate of young Thaddeus and the livestock. But the terrible thing about this horror was that it very slowly and perceptibly moved as it continued to crumble. Ami would give me no added particulars to the scene, but the shape in the corner does not reappear in his tale as a moving object. There are things which cannot be mentioned, and what is done in common humanity is sometimes cruelly judged by the law. I gathered that no moving thing was left in the attic room, and that to leave anything capable of motion that would have been there would have been a deed so monstrous as to damn any accountable being to eternal torment. Anything but a stolid farmer would have fainted or gone mad, but Ami walked conscious through that low doorway and locked the accursed secret behind him. There would be Nahum to deal with now. He must be fed and tended, and removed to some place where he could be cared for. Commencing his descent of the dark stairs, Ami heard a thud below him. He even thought a scream had been suddenly choked off, and recalled nervously the clammy vapor which had brushed by him in that frightful room above. What presence had his cry and entry started up? Halted by some vague fear, he heard still further sounds below. Indubitably there was some sort of heavy dragging, and a most detestably sticky noise, as of some fiendish and unclean species of suction. With an associative sense goaded to feverish heights, he thought unaccountably of what he had seen upstairs. Good God, what eldritch dream world was this into which he had blundered? He dared move neither backward nor forward, but stood there trembling. Excuse me. He dared move neither forward nor backward, but stood there trembling at the black curve of the boxed-in staircase. Every trifle of the scene burned itself into his brain. The sounds, the sense of dread expectancy, the darkness, the steepness of the narrow steps, and merciful heaven, the faint but unmistakable luminosity of all the woodwork in sight, steps, sides, exposed laths, and beams alike. I believe I will call it here. There is not much left for the story. Only about 4 to 5 pages left. I must admit, this took quite an extreme turn. It is fascinating how quickly things have fallen. It's first were the colors, and then the colors went away, seemingly. But they didn't. The color appears to have simply moved into the minds of the family. It is interesting. The color itself seems to be an entity. Perhaps it is a being of pure energy, I'm unsure, but it is frightfully fascinating, and it intrigues me greatly. I am curious as to what you all think of this so far, because I'm finding this brilliantly fascinating. But I believe I will call it here for this video. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and if you have the book with you, thank you for reading along with me, if you so choose. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and a comment down below telling your favorite part. If you enjoy the content that we have, be sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you know when we upload again. Darkus and I are attempting to get back on our usual upload schedule. I know that next Thursday he will be bringing back Fear. But in the meantime, I will see you all in the next video. I am Gresham's and I am signing out.